Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate wrapping up proceedings today and that I'm standing between yourself and a bottle of wine. So the topic for today is the difference between IT and non-IT staff in terms of their password management and creation practices. And I will give you a brief context background, and I'll refer to the research problem before I go into the differences that we found. What does it actually mean? And then I'll elaborate on the limitations and the future of what we intend doing. So first thing that I'd like to do is to give a bottle of South African wine away. I thank you, Nathan, for putting me very last on a Friday afternoon on a session. So I thought it might just be Marcus, myself, Nathan, and Steve, but I see that there's 29 people on the call. So in the chat function, if you get the correct year in which this was published, I'm happy to ship a bottle of South African wine. The author said that an increasing large number of online information systems and associated terminals provide increased access opportunities and may make penetration appear profitable to a wider class of people that may actually compromise it. Joachim, 1978 is a really good guess, but my wine is still safe, and I do need my wine tonight. It's in Stellenbosch in South Africa, and on a Friday evening we drink wine. Although my colleagues in the rest of the country will say on a Friday afternoon we don't wait for the evening. Not 95, not 96, not 2018, and neither 1989. And I love it. The electronic perpetrated crimes seem to be characterized by low physical risk, small probability of detection, anonymity, lack of evidence, and a lack of applicable laws. Now, certainly that has changed a little bit. Siamak, a very good guess there, but it's 1970. So in 1970, the two authors, Stern and Peterson, and it was the first time that I could actually find anything about the humble password and authors talking about the password and securing the online goods. Now, a little bit like the death of Mark Twain, the death of the password is also being over-exaggerated. It's been 51 years, and 51 years later, it remains the most commonly used text-based methods to authenticate assets. We've certainly made great strides on many different ways in biometric authentication and multi-factor authentication, and certainly we're not reliant purely on the humble password anymore. But yet certain systems and certain practices remain, and quite often the passwords chosen by users and the practices that they apply is like using a cheese puff to secure a door. Because the users do not necessarily apply the things that may be commonly known for many of us that we think is a practice that should be widely applied by those that are having access to the information and to the company's assets. Now, very quick background. Managers, and I'm from a business school, so in the business school community, quite interesting. There's a fair amount of literature about the impact of security policies on productivity. We all appreciate the security convenience trade-off, and that we can secure things behind multiple layers of authentication and complexity. But there is a trade-off potentially on productivity in an organization and from a user experience if it's an external facing asset. And it seems that users prefer policies that are more stringent than user-friendly. IT users prefer these policies that are more stringent according to some of the research. So that seems to indicate to us that there's interesting nuances at play here. When do people apply particular practices, and in particular, when do they display the behaviors that they may know about? And Koppel et al. Was one of the first researchers to actually look at the difference in the application of practices between cybersecurity professionals and then the other users within the organization. Now, we were not intrigued by cybersecurity professionals. We were intrigued by IT users in general. As a lecturer in all things digital in the business school, when the printer runs out of paper, my colleagues look at me. When they struggle with Excel, they look at me. When their laptop runs out, they look at me. And it's interesting that if you work in a technological function, or you're seen to be technically proficient, then anything to do with technology, people would naturally turn to you. And it reminded me a little bit about the Peter Starstedt earworm, where you talk like Marlene Dietrich and you dance like Jamer. Your clothes are made by Balmain, and you create passwords like my grandmom. And we were intrigued that if we allow the normal users in organizations to turn to IT users, which do not necessarily work in a cybersecurity function, but they may be help desk support, they may be working in different functions and with different systems, do they actually possess the knowledge and do they practice the behaviors that would allow them to guide the rest of the organization? And that was the whole idea around the research, and that led to a topic that I defined for one of my master students that was supposed to present today. Unfortunately, he can't present. So I'm really presenting the work from Paul Brockbanks that Paul and I did. And we then went into the industry and superimposed these two populations or these two subsets against each other to answer this question. So the research problem was really that the knowledge of password practices do not necessarily relate into safe practices. So that's fairly well known, and many of the behavioral models that we all turn to make a very clear distinction between behavior intent and behavior displayed. And the authors that we took some inspiration from in 2015 indicated that the passwords are not always stronger on the other side of the fence. And that IT users may have higher levels of knowledge, but the practices that they display do not necessarily indicate that. So that was our focus area. We didn't do a typical design of asking them to select between different passwords to indicate for us if they have the ability to distinguish the factors that would make a password more complex. We actually asked them about the practices that they apply. And the problem then is whether these workers who may be seeing as setting the standard exercise more secure password practices. The research design, we had access to a financial services organization because of the value of the assets that you typically have within a financial services organization. It's really important for them to secure their assets, and we were allowed access to the organization to distribute a survey in there. And we then used a self-reported survey, and the survey was very specifically in terms of what do you do? So not what do you know, but what do you do? Which makes it troublesome because we are gathering information that could be sensitive. In the end, we defined IT workers as any person that works within the broad IT function, and non-IT workers as they're not working within the organogram that would report into the CIO or the CTO. Received 182 responses of 118 non-IT users, and then 64 of these users have a direct technical responsibility, be it not a cybersecurity or a security responsibility. And rather important for us was that we were very clear that the confidentiality was guaranteed. It was a reason that the response rate was lower than intended. And when we inquired around that, some of the people said that they felt uncomfortable to share the practices that they apply. Which may, of course, bring a response bias into our responses for those that are more security aware, although there were clear indicators provided that there was no mechanism for us to actually link the response back to individual users. Now, the desirable password practices where things start getting complex. Even the literature remains ambiguous. And it's not always that easy to formulate a question to test a particular practice without describing the practice in a lot of detail. And truth be told, we made one or two mistakes in there that I will show in the limitations later on. What was important for us is to make a distinction between creation practices, the things that we do when we create passwords. So that could be for a new system, but it could also be a forced password change or a voluntary password change. What do I actually do when I create passwords? And then there's the management practices. What are the things that I do to remember my password, to record my password, and over a period of time? And that could also include non-desirable practices like sharing a password with somebody else or recording a password. And then in the middle, we had these two practices which really sits in the creation and the management domain. So having a look at the differences with this very colorful slide, the red indicates IT workers and the light purple is non-IT workers. I'll elaborate a little bit now. And what is interesting when we just look descriptively at the data is that there are clear differences, but the differences cut in both directions. So there are instances of the practices where the data very clearly indicated for us that the less desirable practice is more prevalent within the IT user group, and in other questions, the less desirable practice was in the non-IT group. Tested for statistical significant difference, and 6 out of the 11 practices that we had a look at, we found a difference, and interestingly enough, 4 of these, the more desirable practice was displayed by the IT users, and in 2, the more desirable practice was displayed by the non-IT users. And when we added the user group to it, it became interesting. So if we look around creation, the IT users definitely have a leg up on the creation practices. So there was a statistically significant difference in 4 of, I think, the 6 or 7 creation practices. And in all instances, those working within an IT domain displayed the more desirable practice. The moment that we went into the management practices, there were 2 practices. The one was the reusing of passwords, and the second one was storing of passwords on devices. And it seemed over here that the non-IT users actually were, well, not seemed, according to our data, the non-IT users displayed the more desirable behavior. And when we started scratching, now just to be clear, we didn't ask just one question. So there was a construct that was testing this, and within the construct, there were 2 or 3 questions, and these 2 or 3 questions then gave us an indicator on this particular practice. But when we started looking, although we had construct validity in terms of the different elements that leading to the particular construct, when we started to look at some of the data that came back, because after the questions we allowed for textual data as well, some interesting things emerged. And it's quite likely that the IT users may have significantly more passwords. We captured that information, and they have a lot more passwords that they typically deal with. They typically have not just within the organization where they have access to the backend and other systems access, but they're typically more technically proficient, and they may be using more systems online. So it could be that a simple practice like reusing a password, where the real challenge is actually the crossover between securing an asset of high value and an asset of lower value is the real problem. If I have multiple assets of low value and I share one password amongst them, that is not necessarily as undesirable as when I have my internet banking password or my work system password, and I keep that unique to that one particular system. And in hindsight, we didn't go to that level of granularity when we asked the questions. And then secondly, the IT users, although we made a distinction between writing it down in a public place and writing and recording your password on a sticky note and sticking it on the screen, we did not necessarily capture where writing a password on a device is putting it in a password manager as well. We didn't ask specifically for a password manager, and that could have contaminated our data with recording the password on a device. One of the textual responses indicated from a person, I was unsure to answer the question around capturing a password on the device because I don't capture it anywhere other than in the password manager, but I know that the password manager may be capturing that on my particular device. Right, starting to wrap up, the practitioner value from our research. There's a fair amount of guidance out there. I think it's a fallacy to think that the business users and normal users and organizations are going to read the guidelines or the ISO guidelines or all the interesting things that's happening. But it is true that those working within a technological function or the technology, the IT function, have a higher propensity to access this information. And if they have that higher propensity to access this information, they could, when the non-technical staff turn towards them for guidance, provide guidance that actually assists in creating a higher level of maturity or a better cybersecurity culture within organizations. And when we implement security and education programs, I think it's important for us to appreciate the role of IT workers, those working outside the cybersecurity function. They may be the natural disseminators of knowledge within the organization that others turn to because of their roles. It's quite a common occurrence in organizations that I would rather ask a person at hand for guidance on this, and the literature supports that as well. The second value is that there's not always in the literature a clear distinction between creation practices, the things that I do when I create passwords, and then the management practices, the things that I do over a period of time as I record and share or not, and all of these things as well. And the data indicates for us that there are different challenges and different levels of practices over here. And I think it's important that we then design the interventions for very specific challenges. For example, if it's true that some of the potentially less desirable practice within the IT users is a result of the higher numbers of systems that they have access to, then that is purely leading where other users may be going in the next couple of years. While I was prepping for this presentation, I just thought about my own password manager, and I had a very quick look, and there's 153 sites that's in my password manager, and that doesn't, there's a couple of my highest value assets that definitely not in my password manager. But if you ask me, I would say 30, maybe 40, maybe 50 places, but there's 153 different locations where I authenticate and where the passwords are actually captured. And I think it's a fallacy to think that the normal users could actually take or have the ability to remember those passwords, or even to develop the techniques to behave securely unless guided by us in terms of how to deal with that. Right, wrapping up, a fair amount of limitations in the study. It's a self-reported survey. As security researchers, we always get very excited when there are data breaches, because then we get our hands on the goods, but that's only for creation practices. For management practices, there's not a lot more than what we can do as a self-reported survey. It's a small sample within one company, so obviously we cannot extrapolate beyond the interesting observations that we've made in that one location. And then some limitations, we didn't necessarily were very accurate in terms of the writing down versus the recording of the passwords. The reusing in itself is something that will happen, will occur, and we need to make a very clear distinction between the different values of assets and when it's desirable and when not desirable. And then in terms of the filtering of the staff, it was interesting that afterwards, there was a question posed about what about those working in cybersecurity and IT in general and outside IT? And we thought by being more granular, we may actually find some interesting different subpopulations to populate. Right, so future work, I think reviewer number one from the article had a really excellent summary, saying that despite all the limitations, the general question whether greater knowledge really translates into greater security is interesting. This is not a definitive word, but it's a nice start. I think we could probably rethink the practices. There are very interesting guidelines. Steve actually referred to that on day number one from the NCSC and from NIST, for example. The National Cybersecurity Council would recommend just three random words like Steve bashes Nathan. The NIST, they say 5 words like Steve always bashes Nathan. Now, if you're part of HAISA, then those words are not necessarily random enough. It's a very common occurrence, but if you're outside HAISA, then maybe those words are random. And if people would create passwords like that, we need to be very accurate in terms of what we are asking to understand whether it is a desirable or a non-desirable practice. We need to think the theoretical model. There's so many behavioral models that makes a very clear distinction between behavior and behavior intent. In this instance, we're after behavior, but there may be certain elements in behavioral intent that will help us to understand this better. And we will probably not go for a self-reported survey in future. The nature of that which we are probing for is probably more going to emerge from in-depth conversations. but then you lose anonymity. So it's going to be interesting to see how do we actually take this forward. And truth be told, this was one of my MBA students that did research. If you asked me 4 days ago, where are we going with the research, I would have said to you, it was a really challenging year for many of us. Nowhere. I'm looking forward to drinking some wine and lying on a beach somewhere. But I thoroughly enjoyed the last 3 days. Really interesting conversations, many interesting questions being asked. And probably now we will rethink a little bit. We will redesign and see, is this question interesting enough, and maybe put a topic or two out for some future research students to have a look at. Marcus, thank you. That's me.